The topic for this week's podcast is transgender. When we've had conversations before, whether we're talking about race and ethnicity or if we're talking about gay people, um, what I have suggested is that whenever we are having these conversations, that we defer to the people to whom are the experts. So if I wanted to hear about the experiences and what it means to be an African American woman living today in an urban setting or in a rural setting, then I would really need to default to listening to an African American woman tell her story from the urban perspective or from the rural perspective, because those would be two different perspectives, I think. Being that I'm not an African American woman, I really cannot speak with authority on those issues. Just like when we're talking about gay people, and specifically where I focus, gay people that choose to be Christian. And a lot of the stuff we hear is from people that are not gay. And they are proceeding to tell us about gay people and what they are and what they are not. And that becomes very problematic because they are not experts, nor do they really know anything about that. Their opinions really have no weight, and really they don't have any value. An ultra conservative evangelical Christian pastor who is heterosexual, who never had to worry about choosing, am I going to get erections when I'm around a good looking woman or around a good looking man? Let me decide. Where do I want? Hey, are you going to get erect with a woman or with a man? You better hurry up and decide. See, that's not a decision that is made. That's not a decision that's made. And I know I'm being a little silly there, but my silliness is no less uh, valid than that. In fact, my silliness is more valid than that of the heterosexual uh, man, specifically a preacher, who stands up and tells people what it is to be gay and what the gay, but they're not the experts. What they have to say has zero value. It has zero value, and because 91% of the population is heterosexual and about 9% of the population is homosexual, I'm really not sure what percentage of the population is bisexual that really has the ability to be intimate and participate in loving relationships with people of both genders. I do know that those people exist. Um, I feel that those groups of people are way underestimated as to how many there are, because quite frankly, if you are bisexual, you don't really have a choice into whether or not you're bisexual, but you can kind of train your affections in one direction or another. So those are all things that I don't really know. And so today's topic of transgender, I am not a transgender person. So for me, speaking about transgender people, I'm not the expert. I am not the one to give this expert information. The only thing I can relate to you are the things that I do know and understand. And that's about loving all people and letting them speak the truth about them. And my job then is just to accept and love them. Just like a gay person cannot make other people gay, a transgender person cannot make other people transgender. A transgender adult cannot influence young children to become transgender. That's just not the way. That's just not the way it is. And so, as I share with you some of my thoughts on transgender, I'm going to rely more on my planned thoughts that I have actually composed and written, more than me just talking with you in general, because I want to make sure that I am sharing my thoughts and ideas that would be helpful, not me just talking off of the cuff. And so I want to focus on my very carefully planned out thought, edited and revised thoughts. And to do that, I'm actually going to be reading here from probably about 5 of my books. I wrote a book called Abominations, and there's a little portion in there where I'm going to speak on transgender. This book really started out as 2 books, and one of those books was titled The Christian Response to Transgender, and the other was Loving and Accepting Your Gay family members. And what I found when I was planning out those 2 books, well, the Christian response to transgender pretty much was the Christian response to gay people as well. And so I kind of combined those 2 books together. So I will be reading here from the Christian response to LGBTQ. I'm also going to be sharing the bulk of what I share is going to come from my chapter on transgender in my book. Sometimes you have to stir the pot. Depending how time goes, I might share a little bit from my book, Sin. And I'm not going to share directly from my book, LGBTQ by Birth, Christian by Choice, but I do want to share a little bit about some of my transgender friends, one of whom I've written a chapter about because she consented to allowing me to interview her for this chapter. Another one of my good friends, I had talked to about interviewing him for this project as well, and we had an extreme difficulty getting time to do that. The pandemic hit about that time I was doing those last interviews, and that never happened. But he is a dear friend of mine, and we've had lots of conversations. So I'll share a little bit about him. And another friend of mine here in town, probably the transgender person that I've known the longest. And I've had conversations with her, and I've actually been on her podcast and shows as a guest, specifically during the pandemic time when she was more active in her online blogs, if you will, or her online presence. But while I've had many conversations with her, I've never been blessed with an opportunity just to interview her and hear her tell her story as much as maybe someday I will be able to. So that's at some point I'm going to end with that. The first thing I want to address when we're talking about transgender is when people make the false claim that transgender people are sinning if they are transgender. That's just simply not true. Whether or not we have evidence of transgender people in the Bible, I think there's a possibility in a few places. In fact, when I was interviewing Dr. Bobby Glass, who I'll talk about here at the very end of this, she kind of shared with me about the time Jesus sent 2 of the disciples into the town to secure an upper room for the Last Supper, and said, when you go into town, look for the man carrying a jar of water. And you know what? I've read that many times. And until Dr. Glass pointed that out to me, I really hadn't thought much about that. But, men didn't carry water. So why was this man carrying water? This man was doing woman's work. And I talk more about that as I then began to think more about that. I actually have a podcast around Easter time called An Easter Message Hidden in Plain View. And really, I don't mention flat out a transgender storyline, but kind of I am alluding to the fact that that possibly was a transgender person. Is it important if that was or if that wasn't? Not really. I mean, it shouldn't change the story. But some people would be offended. How dare you suggest that there was a transgender character in the Bible that Jesus sent the disciples to find? Well, whether or not that happened it's more important that someone would be upset that that was a possibility. It should not matter one way or the other. So there is a scripture that people use that talks about a man shouldn't wear the clothes of a woman and a woman shouldn't wear the clothes of a man. I'm not sure that would even apply in the case of transgender, because a trans man is a man. A trans woman is a woman. People would argue with me on that based on the genitalia that was dominant and presented at birth, and so they were classified at that point. I'm not getting into that conversation at this point, but I do want to focus on some of these other things. And this comes from page 40 and 41 of my book, Abominations. And we're looking at the scripture, Deuteronomy 22:5, because quite often I hear this scripture when we have people that are wanting to argue against transgender people. And I don't know why anybody would want to spend time arguing about anyone else. My primary job is to focus on me, and your primary job should be to focus on you. Focusing on someone else, specifically a transgender person, you're wasting your time and you're way off the mark of where God would have you be. So let's look at Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment. For all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God. Well, let's read my commentary that follows that scripture. It looks like the authors of the King James Version missed an edit in this verse. For all that do so are an abomination, instead of our abomination. If this is the intended language, then the King James Version is labeling a person or persons as abominations. And based on our understanding of the 17th century English vocabulary word, abomination or abominations would be describing actions. So an abomination would not become a noun or a label to hang on someone. A person could not be an abomination. Their actions might be labeled that. When I wrote this book, Abomination, I actually compared different versions of the Bible. The Living Bible wrote that men should not wear women's clothing and women should not wear men's clothing. If they do, their behaviors are abhorrent. The Message calls the wearing of another gender's clothing as an abomination. The NIV shortens that quite a bit, from a complex sentence to very simply, God detests anyone who wears the clothing of another gender. It's not about wearing the clothing of another gender. It's about wearing someone else's clothing. The King James Version seems to define people as abominations, while the other three versions in this study, and this was a study of 4 versions of the Bible, remains focused on the behavior. The NIV straddles the fence by stating that God detests anyone who. The bulk of the laws and rules of Moses were grounded with the belief that women were somehow more disgusting than the men because blood came from their bodies. I cannot help but wonder if the unclean garments of women would make the men unclean. Is the ownership of the clothing the major issue? The actual tunics and garments were basically the same at the time of Moses. The head covering or tunic of the women and the men looked the same. My great-grandfather, that I had the opportunity to see a few times, was kind of a horrible man. When I was about 13, I observed him say very unkind things to my mother and my grandmother because they were wearing pants. I assume he considered them abominations because he openly accused them of wearing men's clothing. He also had called my brother and I girls because our hair covered our ears. The pants that my mother and grandmother wore were 1970s double-knit slacks that no one would mistake as the pants belonging to a man. If Moses was focused on the ownership of the clothing, then this whole passage makes sense. It is not possible to apply this scripture, written about 3,500 years ago, to the clothing of the 21st century. Anyone who really focuses on the non-gendered clothing styles of 1500 BCE cannot seriously think this has anything to do with today's garments. Moses was certainly focused on the clothing of a person of another gender being unclean. When someone made a tunic, it only became a male or female garment after it was worn. Otherwise, it was a unisex article of clothing until a particular gender owned it. If I decide to go to Macy's and buy a sweater from the ladies' department because it fits my narrow shoulders better, no one would know except me. If I am the owner of that sweater, then it is a man's sweater, even if it was purchased in the ladies' department. I am not stupid. I know that people use this passage to preach hate against transgender people. Anyone who thinks this passage has had anything to do with gendered clothing of today is uninformed. To know better and continue to hate on people is antithetical to Christianity. God does not care what you wear. Male and female clothing are human constructs that have changed and evolved over time. And so that's a little section from my book, Abomination, that we can apply to today's conversation. So it was an abomination for a man to wear a woman's clothing because it might have blood on it, even if that garment had been washed. And so the woman was unclean because she bled out of parts of her body. And so if the man touched that, then he would be unclean. That's a ritual uncleanliness, which would make him an abomination for doing such. And I want to share just a little section that I wrote on transgender in my book, The Christian Response to LGBTQ. The third chapter of Galatians is focused on the dichotomy of living by our faith or living by following lists of rules. This chapter reminds the people of Galatia and to us still today that legalism is not Christianity. God does not discriminate. God does not classify us by nationality, whether we are independent or dependent on others, whether we are male or female. Our gender and other human classifications are irrelevant to God. It does not include our eye color, but that is also irrelevant to God. God does not care whether or not our eyes are blue, green, brown, black, hazel, or violet. God does not care about any of our genetic traits or characteristics. Jesus demonstrated time and time again that all means all and that we cannot discriminate and claim to follow him. We all are children of God through Jesus and no other reason. All of the human barriers are non-existent in the eyes of God. God does not think some type of people are better than another based on human differences. God does not care if you are male or female. God does not think males are better and females are inferior. These differences are not relevant to God. If gender is not important in the eyes of God, then I must then conclude that God does not care what gender I am. God does not care what gender you are. God does not care what gender someone else is. In God's eyes, gender is not relevant. It then logically follows that gender identity and gender expression are also not relevant to God. If it is not relevant to God, then it cannot be relevant to us. Clothing and fashions are contrived concepts. Unless you're examining a bra or a jockstrap, there really isn't anything about clothing that is really male or female. Societal norms are not relevant to God because they do not exist in reality. Societal norms are contrived. God does not care what you wear. Some professing Christian women have their breasts augmented, have lip injections, use Botox, makeup, and may even have eye lifts, butt lifts, and face lifts. There are male Christians who like bigger breasts and are happy when their wives make themselves look better. I do not see Christian leaders on the television preaching against coloring hair, fashionable clothing, or cosmetic surgery. If a transgender person selects clothing, makeup, or even cosmetic surgery to help them feel better about themselves, there's not a significant difference. Another argument is grounded in the belief that a person is changing what God created them to be. This then becomes problematic because the reverse of this argument is what is used against gay males and lesbian females when they are told they must change their orientation. Arguments focused on surgical transitions then also align with the cosmetic surgery and changes to hair color and texture. Let's just pretend for a moment that transgender was a sin. What happens when a post-operative transgender person comes to church? If you are from a church that uses the terminology "get saved," what happens when this transgender person gets saved? Much of the hormonal therapy is not reversible. Advocating for surgical reversal of all transgender surgeries is also ridiculous. If a person comes to church that is with their second spouse, having divorced the first spouse, the church does not require them to end their second marriage and remarry their first spouse. When a person comes to church or comes to God or gets saved, the church loves and accepts them as they are going forward, just as God does. Even if beliefs about transgender persons are in issue, accepting a person going forward should be easily comprehended. When we accept Jesus and decide to follow his lessons and example at a particular time and place in our life, whatever we are, that is how God accepts us. In reality, when identifying how a church or a Christian should respond to a transgender person or any LGBTQ person, it should be simple. God calls us to love and receive all people. The church's job is to provide a place in ministry where God can speak to every person. Doesn't matter if they are male, female, trans, brown, beige, right-handed, left-handed, deaf, blind, or any other adjective. I do not understand how a person can be born with particular genitalia and yet believe they have the wrong set of parts. In reality, if I made a list of all the things I do not fully understand, it'd be a very long list. Transgender is another item on my list of things that I do not fully understand. There are some things, however, that I do know and I do understand. I have friends that are transgender. I participate in a book study where they are also participants. I have interviewed several for literary projects. I have had dinner with them. I've attended gatherings with them. I go to church with them. They are people. As you would expect, when I'm with a group of people, I laugh, tell stories, listen to others, and usually eat something good, maybe tacos or some sort of dessert. In social situations, or even while sitting in the pew at church, the gender of those around me is not relevant. Within my group of friends, the fact that some are transgender is not relevant. Do I really care what kind of clothing that people around me are wearing? Not really. Do I really care about the cosmetic surgical procedures that my friends have had? Not really. Am I going to ask my friends to let me look in their underwear to see what parts they have or do not have? No. When I walk in the mall, I sometimes pass a really tall woman and I wonder, is she transgender? Then I wonder if she ever is accused of being transgender just because she's a tall woman. At this point, I realize that the issue in society today is most likely not really about being transgender, but is about being thought or suspected as transgender. We cannot really prove whether or not someone is transgender without being rude and inappropriate. So the real issue is thinking someone might be transgender and treating them differently because of thoughts and perceptions. Transgender people do not want to convert other people to be transgender. They just want to live authentically. While I do not understand what it would be like to really feel that I have the wrong gendered body, I can imagine it would be a difficult existence. I do not think it would be possible to fake it. I also do not believe that by transitioning, all their feelings and problems instantly go away. I wonder how many women in the church have had breast implants. I wonder how many blonde women in the church are biologically blonde. I wonder how many men in the church have had Botox injections. I wonder how many women are wearing shirts and sweaters that they bought in the men's department in the store. I know that a very small percentage of the population is born with genitalia of both male and female. I assume that if this is a possible variation, then it must be possible that some are born with genitalia opposite of their internal gender. I must believe that a mismatch is possible. Gender may not be as binary as we once believed. It is true that not all people fall into two genetic categories of female, XX, or male, XY. There have been cases where some assumed female by all the physical evidence are actually genetically male, XY. Some people are genetically XO or XXY. People with these genetic markers may have female or male external genitalia. They technically are not genetically male or female, but they might technically be both male and female. If a person is genetically XYY, then they will have external male genitalia. There are more genetic combinations that are rarer, but they exist. The important thing to know and understand is that male and female are not the binary classifications we have thought them to be. External evidence is not always conclusive genetically or in other ways. We do not fully know and understand the differences of male and female or the possible variations within a person's mind and soul. Biologically, we know that gender lies on a continuum or spectrum. Perhaps this continuum is part of what is yet to be fully understood within all LGBTQ people. We live in a world where gender is believed to be strictly binary, 100% male or 100% female. Scientifically and medically, we know this is not true. When the mind and soul of a person's gender is further away from the outward evidence, then conflict exists within that person. For a small percentage of the population, this comes out. Research indicates that about 1% of the human population is transgender. This means that 1 out of every 100 people believe that their actual gender is different than how their external genitalia determine them to be classified at birth. Because this is such a small number, and because of the reality that many transgender people spend their life trying to hide, we have limited exposure and experience with transgender people. Humans have historically feared and discriminated against those they classified as different. God created mankind as male and female. Be careful not to skip over the word and. We are all created both male and female. Have you noticed that men have nipples? Perhaps none of us are 100% male or 100% female. Perhaps Paul was teaching us in Galatians that we are people and gender and other classifications are not important or relevant. I know that there are effeminate men. I know that there are masculine women. I know that masculine and feminine are contrived concepts and are perceptions that may differ by culture. I know that there are people that are accused of being transgender that are not. I also know that there are some transgender people that are not identified as transgender. In reality, God calls me to love all people. God does not call me to just love people I understand. If that were true, there would be quite a problem, as I tend to not understand most people. This comes from my book, Sin, on page 41. Where should we start when trying to identify and describe transgender sin? We would be forced to focus on the verbs and not the adjectives. Practically all the rhetoric and public objection is focused on appearance, including items of clothing, makeup, hairstyles, hair coloring, and cosmetic surgery. These actions are prevalent in all communities and are not only found among the transgender. All of these things are visible and found in the cisgender community, including the churches and political families leading the war against transgender people. In every church in America, there are more blonde women than are actually biologically blonde. Breast implants, Botox, and lip injections, oh my. We might begin by talking about medication and hormone therapy. But then we would have to engage with hormone replacement therapy that the cisgender community takes following menopause in women or low T in men. We might also have to claim that taking pills for erectile dysfunction is against God's will because being impotent must be what God wanted, or else the erection would not be elusive. If God wanted you sexually active, then you wouldn't need pills to get erect. Transgender people may sin just like all people, but their sins are not unique to being transgender. Everything pertaining to transgender specific sins is written in this box. This box is empty. Several years ago, I worked on a phenomenological study where the phenomenon was that there were LGBTQ people who chose to be Christian. And picking up from where my microphone went dead, I was talking about this phenomenological study that I did several years ago, with the phenomenon being that there are people that are LGBTQ. The phenomenon is they choose to be Christian anyway, which is quite a thing because the church really pushes LGBTQ people away. It's like they don't want them. Sometimes that's not their actual message, but that is the perception when LGBTQ people try to integrate into a traditional church. So anyway, this was a research, where I talk about the methodology. I talk about my research questions, talk about my findings. I talk about the summary and the application. And there were 25 people that I interviewed for that. It was a little unreadable because it was a research study and it was the writing about that phenomenological study. So I did put out a second edition of that book here a few years ago, where I took 15 of those 25 stories and took out a lot of the research language in there and just made this a readable book so that we can look at these stories. And one of the stories that's actually included in both of these is by Dr. Bobby Glass, a transgender woman who shares her story. And one of the things that she shared in her story was that growing up, she had no reason to assume she wasn't like her sisters and thought she was a sister. But she was identified as male at birth. And when she got ready for go to kindergarten, her dad took her to the barbershop to get a boy haircut to go to school. And when he said, well, we need to go to the barbershop because you're going to school and you need to look like a boy, she was devastated. It's like, why would I want to look like a boy? I'm a girl. And so it was quite a traumatic thing. And Dr. Glass shared more of her story and went through that, and the experience of life taking her up to near to where she is today, because I interviewed her not too many years ago. I also, several years ago, had an opportunity to interview a friend of mine, Dina Montalvo, who is a transgender drag performer. In the 1960s, she performed in drag. In the late 70s, she went ahead and came out as transgender and began the transgender process. And she also had some similar stories in that as she was growing up, she was like her sisters. And so she wanted to do the things that her sisters did. And so there was a little bit of cognizant dissonance in between uh, what people were expecting and then what she really felt she was. And so I had the opportunity to interview her over multiple weeks, actually multiple years, from the first time I talked with her until we started structuring the interviews to write her biography here. And so I don't know if that is a common element for all of those. I also have a friend who has had triplets. Um, I remember when they were born, little babies, and it was like, wow, she has triplet daughters. One of her children, though, from the very youngest of age, not even two, would not wear a dress, and was adamant, I'm not wearing that. I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. Um, these triplets now have all graduated from college. And when this one child um, uh, was 17, not quite 18, but at 17, with parental consent from both of her parents, and that there was some problem getting both parents to consent. Actually, began some of the transitioning process, and to see the joy in this young man's eyes and life and being as um, he became who he was really a joy and a pleasure to see this young man blossom. And then now to see the triplets grown up, out of college, two girls, one boy. Um, Even when we don't understand fully, because on some level we can't ever fully understand, one thing I can understand, the one thing I can understand is seeing the transition in this young man's life. And I'm not even talking about the physical here. I'm just talking about the transition in this young man's life and just the being who they are. I have some other transgender friends here in town. I have a friend, Dana. It's probably um, my longest friendship, or the longest knowing someone who's transgender. I've had some conversations with her during the pandemic. She actually had a uh, a web show. Wasn't really a podcast, but kind of a podcast that she did, and I was the guest on her show once, where we had a panel and we were discussing some different topics. I really appreciate that because I got to know her more. And there are times where I've been able to have conversations with her, or she has just willingly shared some of the things that have happened in her life as she's transitioned. For most of the Houston LGBTQ community, uh, uh, she has a stage name other than Dana. Most people probably don't even know her by the name Dana, but she truly is an awesome person in looking at how she has lived the life that is her life. Um, who she is today. Um, she she's very free in conversation and talk about her life before transitioning, and even posting some of her boy pictures as a child sometimes on her Facebook. I have another very very good friend, Z, who's a trans man who goes to my church. Awesome man. I just adore him. His wife just passed the beginning of this year, and she was an awesome lady, and such a support to him during his transition uh, as an adult, having already had and raised children. And to see him as the man he is, and hear him tell his story and the story of transitioning and the support he had of his wife is um, truly a life-changing experience to actually know these transgender people. There are even people that sometimes we label as transgender, but sometimes when you have a conversation with them, they might even say, well, I'm not even sure I truly identify as transgender. And I have some friends that now label themselves as transgender but didn't used to. And all of that really doesn't matter, people. It really doesn't matter. Your heart and your soul is neither male nor female, or it's both male and female. I really don't know which it is. But as people, we love people. If you claim to be a Christian, a follower of the life and lessons of Jesus, you really don't have any wiggle room. We are called to love all people. We're called to minister to all people. You know, it doesn't matter if someone comes up to you and they say, hi, my name is Joe. My pronouns are he, him. Or someone comes and says, hi, my name is Sally. My pronouns are she, her. And it doesn't matter whether they have a deep voice or a high-pitched voice, or if someone tells you they're Sally and they've got a mustache and a deep voice, it does not matter. That does not give you any excuse not to love them as your neighbor. If you've got people that are your neighbors that you don't even understand for lots of reasons, people from very different cultures. I live in Houston, one of the most multicultural cities in the entire world. And there are people all around me that I may not understand their culture, but that does not matter. That does not give me a loophole for loving them as my neighbor. We cannot purposely try to hurt other people. That's just the way it is. You can't. We cannot purposefully, we cannot support politicians that purposefully target certain groups of people and try to hurt them. We just can't do that. There are no loopholes in following the life and lessons of Jesus that allow us to do that. Listen to me. There are no loopholes that would allow us to do that. It's just the way it is. So, the sad truth is there are many people who call themselves Christian, even whole denominations and whole churches, or portions and factions of a church, that have no interest and no intention of actually following the life and lessons of Jesus, because they outwardly reject the life and lessons and callings of Jesus. And when they see people doing this, said, what are you doing? Y'all are woke. I don't want to be woke. I want to be asleep. I want to stick my head in the sand, and I want to ignore those things Jesus told us to do, because I'm sorry, Jesus, I ain't doing that. No, they don't even say sorry. They say, Jesus, I'm not doing that. I'm not for those people. Are you kidding me? So, this whole message on transgender is much, much bigger than transgender. The call to be Jesus to everyone we meet includes the transgender people. It's not everyone except the transgender people. And it's everyone. Thank you for watching and participating in this discussion on transgender. I'm not an expert on transgender. I'm not a transgender person. There's lots of things I don't know and understand. But this one thing I know, God calls me to love all people no matter what. I have transgender friends and I love them dearly, and I do not want to see anyone or any political rhetoric or politicians or government or anyone hurt them. And because they're hurting them for no reason. Their reasons they give for wanting to hurt these people are not valid, and they're false. They're out battling windmills. They're battling things that don't even really exist. And so when we love all people, when we befriend all people, you know what? People are people. If I'm playing dominoes at game night, it doesn't matter to me if I'm looking around the table. Gay man, straight lady, trans man, gender, somewhere in between, I'm not sure. I don't really care. Uh, uh, funny person, person who's always got a chip on their shoulder, someone who always cheats. I mean, these are people. These are people I'm hanging out with. These are people that I'm loving and accepting and showing the love of Christ, because that's what I'm called to do. And that's what you're called to do as well. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Be sure to share it with those you know would benefit from listening to this content. Thank you.